This is a demo illustrating how Arjuna's Agility product can be used to create and manage customizable service agreements for the cloud. Before we start looking at the Agility portal itself and how Agility operates, we'll begin by looking at an example application that we'll use throughout the demo. The application is a real-world application called InkSpot. And InkSpot has been developed for scalable and secure cloud computing. It's a platform for research and analysis. It runs on the Amazon cloud and also on Azure, and can also run on a variety of private clouds. It provides a set of high-level services to help you do collaborative research. I'll just very briefly give you an example of how InkSpot works. So this is the InkSpot portal. InkSpot enables you to store data, to manage workflows, to communicate with other people about what you're doing with that workflow and data, integrate other applications, and all in all, the focus is on storing, analyzing, and sharing data for sort of large number crunching work. Now what I'll do is I'll go and look at the workflows that are under my management inside InkSpot. And let's look at this one in particular called expenses per organization. So this gives me an editor that lets me insert new tasks and new data sources, change the structure. And essentially what's happening is here data is flowing in, a number of tasks are being executed, then data is produced at the end. And then that data can be used by other people and the pieces of the workflow can be used by other people. So we'll simply execute a workflow. And by executing a workflow, what's happening is that InkSpot sends the individual tasks to be executed on some infrastructure somewhere. Okay, so that's complete. So that's InkSpot in operation. I'm not going to go into any more detail around InkSpot beyond that. The work that Agility has done with InkSpot has been to improve some of the non-functional quality of service and to introduce some variable quality of service. And I'll explain that more as we go along. So let's look at some of the problems that InkSpot might have to face following its launch as a cloud service. So if it's early to market and if the service proves popular, the InkSpot application and service can expect a large number of users. Those users may have very different service requirements. Hopefully they want the InkSpot service itself, but the quality of service that they require from that may vary considerably. Some of them may have very high reliability requirements, others may have very high pricing requirements, data security requirements, support, etc., etc. In fact, there's a multi-dimensional collection of quality of service requirements that these users might be interested in. But because InkSpot is early to market, there's a set of customers that are very happy with the quality of service being offered. There are others for whom the quality of service is a little bit low, but this is an interesting application, so that they decide to go with it. There are another set, perhaps, for whom the quality of service being provided is too high, in that they would be happier with a lower quality of service if they could pay a lower price. But all of these consumers originally sign up to the service. But then, inevitably, if the service is successful, competitors will arise. So here's a competitor who's probably focusing on sort of high-end customers, and one here who's focusing on low-end, perhaps offering a lower price but lower quality of service. And because of that, the InkSpot customers are squeezed. So InkSpot is unable to cope with the variation in the requirements of consumers. But InkSpot also has another problem in that consumers' requirements change over time. And this particular customer of InkSpot perhaps has some stronger requirement for quality of service after a period of time and moves to one of the competitors in order to achieve that. So not only can InkSpot not handle the variation, but it also can't handle the variability for individual consumers. Of course, what InkSpot would really like to do is be able to offer a very broad range of quality of service, and by doing so maintain their market position. So catering for variation in a lot of customers and variability within some range for quality of service. This requires two things if it's to be achieved. One is it requires support for service agreements between the consumers and the application. Without a vanilla quality of service, it's no longer possible to have a one-size-fits-all, click here to sign up agreement. Consumers want different things from quality of service. They also want to be able to change the quality of service on demand. So as well as service agreements, we also require some means by which the application can respond to changes in the service agreements it has with its consumers. So these two things, in the form of service agreements and policy, are the focus of our agility. So here's our starting position from the demo perspective. So there's a deployment of the InkSpot application, offering a service to some set of consumers. And the InkSpot application in this case is using some private IT infrastructure, perhaps inside the same organization, in order to deploy workflows and to do the work requested by consumers. And those consumers are getting some particular quality of service. So let's imagine that the aspect of quality of service we're concerned with here is security. So security is not a particular focus of agility. This is just one example. So in this case, the consumer perhaps requires a fairly high level of data security, let's say, and because he knows that the work is going to his own private IT inside his same organization, he's satisfied with that. But if I was a consumer who was happy with a lower data security, then perhaps I would want to have my workflows running on a public cloud. And if we wanted to achieve that, we would have to have a completely separate, independent deployment of the InkSpot application, which would send work to a public cloud, a less than satisfactory scenario. This is where agility comes in. So with agility, we can create an overlay network above the actual service delivery layer. And we do so by deploying instances of agility alongside the InkSpot application on the private infrastructure and on, in this case, the public cloud infrastructure. With those in place, we can then create service agreements between those parties that will let them cooperate so that workflow could be sent potentially to the private IT or to the public cloud. So this is the agility portal. So at this point, we already deployed agility alongside the InkSpot application on the private infrastructure and on the public cloud infrastructure. Agility has these three tabs that we could look at. One is just purely some logging information. We're not going to worry too much about that. But the two primary aspects of agility are its management of service agreements and its management of policies. We're going to start by creating service agreements between the agility alongside the InkSpot application and agility on the private infrastructure and on the public infrastructure. So we'll begin by clicking on the Service Agreement tab. So I'm now going to create a new relationship. This is a new service agreement. And the first one I'm going to create is going to be with the private IT infrastructure. And to save us having to put an agreement in manually, we have a pre-prepared one here. I'll import this into Agility. And this agreement is essentially a set of name-value pairs. Some of these identify the two parties concerned. This one gives an alias for this particular agreement, called private. This particular agreement has been characterized as having a high security level, because this is our private infrastructure inside our own organization. So now from the InkSpot side, I propose that to the private infrastructure side, and the agreement has been accepted. Now I'll return to the top level for service agreements, and I'll do exactly the same thing with the public infrastructure side. I'll import a template, almost identical to the last one, except it's called public, and in this case we've characterized it as being low security. So I propose that to the public cloud side, and that agreement is accepted. So we now have in place these two agreements, one with the private infrastructure and one with the public infrastructure. Okay, so we now have this overlay network in place with Agility. And now what we're going to do is try to do something useful with that overlay network. What we're going to look at is how we can introduce policy to enable us to manage variation in security requirements. So we're going to insert some policy into Agility. And That policy will make decisions based upon the workflows that it's being requested to run as to whether those workflows should be sent to the private IT infrastructure or to the public infrastructure. By doing so, we're offering a much broader range of quality of service around security. So we can handle a different set of customers, and also within the same customer, we can handle variability when a customer at one point wants high security, at another point wants low security. So having set up the initial network, let's just see what happens if we try to execute a workflow. So here's our workflow, and I'll actually execute it twice just to make sure that we're getting consistent results. So that's the first execution. I execute it again. So what we've actually done is set up a network which has the potential to allow the organizations to work together, but we actually haven't introduced any policy yet to let us make use of that network. So having executed that work, and we go to our log inside of Agility, which is simply logging events, we can see that both of those workflows went to our private infrastructure. So even though we have a relationship with the public side, the work continues to flow to our own private infrastructure, and that's because we haven't inserted any policy that will let us do anything differently. In order to introduce the policy that is able to make decisions about workflow placement, we're going to have to add some policy to this network that we've created. So at this point, Inkspot has no knowledge whatsoever of the concepts of security and of workflow deployment. It simply has been designed to send workflow, put a workflow into a queue which is simply plucked off by a particular infrastructure. So what we're going to do is we're going to use Agility to let it make more dynamic decisions. And the point of stress here is that not a single line of code inside the target application has to change. And this is a real application which was running successfully before and will now continue to run in exactly the same way, except that its behavior will change because of service agreements that we've created. So we'll start by going to policy management. We see we already have a number of policies inserted into Agility, but we're going to add some new ones. These are pre-prepared ones. We're going to add two policies, and these policies are concerned with the management of workflow deployment based upon decisions around security. This could have been structured as a single policy, but we've chosen to structure them in this case as two separate policies. So those policies are now in place. So now there is logic inside Inkspot or inside Agility running alongside Inkspot that understands these concepts of workflow deployment and of security. So now we're actually going to make use of those, and we're going to do so by making it explicit with both of the parties that they're able to run a particular workflow. So we'll start with the private infrastructure, and we're going to create a sub-agreement with our relationship with the private infrastructure that allows it to run this particular, explicitly to run this particular workflow. So again, I import a template. This template effectively says this agreement particular workflow is one that you're allowed to run. So from Inkspot, I propose that to the private infrastructure. That's accepted. And I'll do exactly the same thing with the public infrastructure. I'll give it explicit permission to run this particular workflow. So same as before, I propose it and it's accepted. So we now have explicit sub-agreements with our agreements with the private and public infrastructure to let them both run this particular workflow. And now if we return to our Inkspot portal and return to our workflow and we execute it, once again we'll execute it twice. Execute it again, and it's completed. We'll now return to the Agility portal and see where that work was actually deployed and where it executed. So if we look in the log for Agility, this time we can see that the last two workflows to have been executed One of them went to the private infrastructure and one went to the public infrastructure. So this is because we've enabled both sides now to run that workflow, and therefore we're load balancing between the two. So we've seen that it's possible from the InkSpot side to create service agreements with, and it's possible to modify those agreements from the InkSpot side, but it's also possible to modify agreements between parties from either side. So having shown you how we've used Agility to take account of service agreements concerned with workload deployment on the basis of security requirements, let's look at the insertion of another support for non-functional requirement, and that's around pricing. If we look at what we've got at the moment, we have a network whereby the InkSpot application can send work to the private infrastructure or the public. And having done so, it would be nice to try to get these two parties to compete on price. And to do that, we're going to create a pricing policy that we insert into Agility. And that pricing policy will take into account any information that these parties send it about pricing, and then we'll act appropriately. By doing so, we're providing a much broader range of pricing options for our users. So we're providing for a greater number of users or for variability within a particular user. In order to have Agility consider pricing, we have to introduce a piece of policy. And that piece of policy is the workflow cost policy. So we register that with the system. And so far, we've only looked at the system really primarily in terms of from the InkSpot side. We're now going to have another look at how one might modify existing agreements from the perspective of the other side of the relationship, in this case the public side. So here we have our expenses per organization workflow agreement that says that we can run this workflow in the public infrastructure. So if the public infrastructure becomes aware of the fact that we are now taking into account pricing, they can take advantage of that fact by modifying the service agreement with a new feature concerned with pricing. So I'm going to modify the agreement. This is from the administrator's point of view on the public cloud. And I'm going to use a template in order to help me import this new feature. So we've added a new feature called workflow cost. This is a feature that we hadn't considered at all when we first deployed the application. But now that it's been advertised that this feature will be considered, we can add it to our service agreement and set an appropriate value. So let's say from our point of view, we set the value of 99 cents. So we'll carry out this particular workflow for 99 cents. I propose that to the far side, and it's accepted by InkSpot. So let's just return to the viewpoint from InkSpot's perspective. And what we'll do now is we'll execute some workflow again. Again, I'll execute two workflows. Okay, that's the first one and the second one. Okay, and now we'll return to the log and see where they were executed. So in this case, both workflows went to the public infrastructure, and that's because the public infrastructure is now advertising that its pricing, whereas the private infrastructure hasn't bothered to do so, and by default we simply send the work to whoever is telling us about pricing. Now hopefully after some time the private infrastructure begins to realize that it's losing a lot of work to the public infrastructure and decides to compete. So let's view things now from the private infrastructure point of view. So they can do exactly the same thing that the public infrastructure did. They can go and modify their existing service agreement with InkSpot to take into account this new feature cost, and then they could set it to their own value. And let's say they undercut the public infrastructure by setting it to 98 cents. They propose that to InkSpot, and InkSpot will accept that change. If we now go back to InkSpot Science, and once again execute our workflows, First one. Second one. Return to our portal. We can see now that the workflow is going to the private side because the private infrastructure has undercut the public infrastructure. So just to stress once again, this ability to handle pricing did not require any changes to the underlying application. So we've shown you here two examples of adding functionality to an existing running cloud application. The two changes are concerned with choices about deployment of workflow based on security and choices of deployment based on pricing being offered by a couple of competitors. Both of those changes did not require any modification at all to the Inkspot application or to the way in which the normal users of the Inkspot application interact with Inkspot. What they did add was an overlay which lets us manage service agreements from the perspective of administrators representing the users of the system, Inkspot itself, and the private and public infrastructure. And they were able to use this infrastructure to create agreements to enable you then to modify the behavior of the underlying application. Okay, this ends the demo. Thank you for your attention.